Welcome to the first episode ever of Crime to Court, York County. My name is Kevin Brackett. I'm the solicitor for the 16th Circuit, which is York and Union counties. Here it's the 16th out of 16 circuits here in South Carolina. And the solicitor is basically the chief prosecuting officer, what they call the district attorney in other places. I am with my friend Sheriff Kevin Tolson, and we're excited to be bringing this program to you. This is going to be our attempt to bring you, the viewer, into the patrol cars and the courtrooms of York County and educate you on how your criminal justice system functions. Our job, between the two of us, is to protect you and keep you safe, and having you educated on how the system functions really helps us do our job, because if you understand how we do our jobs, then it'll help you in the long run, helping you to help us keep you safe. So it's our hope that this show and the future episodes will increase the transparency into the criminal justice system and increase your confidence in how we do our jobs. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to take just a moment to let the viewers know basically what the sheriff's function is. It's a very historical position. It's a constitutional office. It's been since the inception of the state. And the sheriff's primary job is to police the unincorporated areas of York County. So quite simply put, I'm the police agency for those who don't live in cities. I also operate a 540 bed jail, and we're also responsible for serving all of the civil process in York County, countywide, which we'll get into some more of those things later in later shows.
Sure. We'll look forward to doing that. You've got a big job, a lot of different responsibilities. People don't know a lot about all that. And we'll be detailing many different specific things that the sheriff's office is responsible for, as well as the solicitor's office. I hope to go into topics like just giving you a broad overview of how the criminal justice system functions, how the process works for a criminal case as it moves through, what is the role of the prosecutor, plea bargaining, jury service, how trials work, how sentencing works, a lot of myths and misunderstandings around some of these important topics. And so I look forward to being able to do a deeper dive on some of these topics going forward. Now, for this particular episode, we are going to focus on an incident that took place earlier this year.
That's correct. The January 16th shooting of the 4 officers in York County. We'll be able to take that case, and it will highlight a lot of areas that were obviously utilized that night through law enforcement, and then later on when the case got to your office, the areas that your office touches on, the various process that we went through from the 911 call through the case disposition.
Yeah, well, it's a good vehicle to touch lightly on a bunch of different topics that hopefully we'll be able to go into a lot more depth on later, but it had a lot of moving parts and a lot of different issues that I think the public will be interested in. Plus, learning just exactly what took place that day, I think, is important for the public to understand what these men went through. So when we come back, we look forward to going into that in a little more detail, but we're going to take our first break and come back here in just a minute to talk more about that. Thank you.
Now he's saying he might get violent. Now he's getting out his rifle and he's walking down the steps. Don't be messing with that stuff. No. Put it down.
That's a painful call for any police agency to receive. What happens when you get a call like that, Sheriff?
Well, unfortunately, this is how most domestic calls begin, and that's a call to 911. And so at that point, what's happening is that the telecommunicators is gathering just as much information as they can so that they can gauge the appropriate response for our first responders, and 99% of the time those responders are going to be the folks in uniform patrol. Those are the folks that you see riding in the cars. And so that's exactly what happened that night. Information was relayed from the 911 center to our officers, and we send the appropriate number of officers. And of course, we knew that he was armed, that Mr. McCall was armed at the time, and so that obviously requires the use of more officers.
Yeah. Did this come from the residence of Christian McCall?
It did.
Okay.
Yes. And so our officers arrived on scene, and he had fled the area. So he was not at the house, and we were able to speak with the victim and the victim's daughter. And based on the information that we had, the decision was made to notify our K-9 unit. And the K-9 unit is about a 20-man unit that responds to various calls where we're tracking missing folks.
So when he fled the house, he stayed in the area. He didn't take his car? Or...
Correct. He fled on foot.
And so where did he go? Where was it?
He went out the back door, and that is basically all the information that we had at the time. And so our K-9 officer, our Sergeant Randy Clinton, when he arrived on scene, he felt that there was enough danger there to notify the SLED, State Law Enforcement Division, aviation unit and helicopter support. And so those folks were initiated, and we waited until basically they got on scene until Sergeant Clinton and his team of 3 other individuals went into the woods and picked up the track of McCall, and they began to track him, and shortly, not very long, once they got into the woods, McCall fired his rifle and shot Sergeant Clinton. We were able to return fire enough to make Mr. McCall sort of leave the area, and the officers were able to drag Sergeant Clinton to safety.
Okay. Was the helicopter in the area at this time?
The helicopter was
okay.
just in the area.
Okay, and so were they able to see what's happening on the ground?
The helicopter pilots are, through the use of FLIR, forward-looking infrared, which is SLED helicopter is obviously equipped with that, and it allows.
This is at nighttime.
It's at nighttime. It's very cold on January 16th. I remember it was extremely cold. I think it was in the 20s, and so the FLIR is designed to pick up heat sources, and so being very cold that evening, it was very much easier to pick up those heat sources, and we could actually see McCall moving through the woods.
I see.
And so once that happened, of course, a lot of things began to transpire and take place. We notified our entire SWAT team to respond, because we obviously had a much more serious manhunt at this time, and we utilized the reverse 911 system, which we'll talk about more in depth at a later show, to notify residents in the area basically to shelter in place. We didn't go into exact details about what was going on, because those calls are very limited in time.
Yep.
But we notified the residents to shelter in place.
Stay in their homes, basically.
Stay inside.
Yeah.
That's right. And
Okay.
and then, of course, through radio traffic that other agencies monitor, we had a tremendous response of all of the other agencies within York County coming to help our officers help find this man. And so,
how many officers did you have out there, do you think?
I know I had 40, and there were officers from nearly every agency, either offering to help or had sent officers to sit on the perimeter and to assist us. So I would imagine there were probably 60 to 70 officers in the immediate area at that time.
Now, the helicopter remained on scene throughout this initial call out and response, so the helicopter is able to observe from the air what's taking place with all these different officers moving in, and I think we're looking at some of that video right now.
That's correct.
We see some guys carrying somebody out of the woods.
Yes,
there,
so that's just a snippet of pulling Sergeant Clinton to safety, and then now you can see the suspect, McCall, being tracked by the helicopter and the FLIR, and I think at one point in time he actually looks up at the helicopter.
So that's what they were actually seeing from the air.
That's what the pilots are seeing, and they're relaying that information to us on the ground.
Okay. Well, what happened after that?
Well, it's important to note that the helicopter pilots can, you can only see a certain field of vision with the FLIR, so they can't, to know where we're at and know where he's at, it's more important to know where he's at. And the helicopter pilots radioed that they had indicated a heat source up under a boat, and that was the last known location that we knew him to be. And so at some point in time, obviously the helicopter is limited in fuel, and the helicopter had to leave the area.
Yeah.
And so when they left the area, the decision was made to try to locate McCall where he was last known. It was very close to a residence, and he had been on the run for quite some time, and they felt like they had him at that location where he was last seen. The sled helicopter leaves and went to go gas up.
Yeah.
And we can probably talk a little bit more about this as we come back from our
That's probably a good
break.
time to take a break. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about what took place next when we come back. Stay with us.
I need flight for one of our patients out here.
Affirmative,
Give me the closest LZ.
affirmative 133. Flight has been notified. Getting them en route. Closest LZ is going to be the AME Zion, Charlotte Highway, and South Parham. Charlotte Highway, South Parham.
For Chuck Haynes, we're going to need two helicopters reference medical.
That's affirmative, sir. We have 2 helicopters going to that same landing zone, South Parham, Charlotte Highway. 2 birds in the air.
Obviously, some disturbing radio traffic there. What took place when we took the break? You had officers kind of circling around a house to where they thought the suspect was. What took place there?
Yeah, well, the officers were approaching the area where the suspect was last seen, and he had hid up under a deck of a house, very well hidden. And when they rounded around that deck, he opened fire on the officers, and in that event, 3 officers ended up being shot, one of them being Michael Doty, who was fatally wounded, and then 2 others of varying degree of seriousness. Sergeant Kyle Cummings with York PD, and also Sergeant Buddy Brown of our uniform patrol. And so there's a lot of things going on at this point. There's a lot of coordination between fire, EMS, Charlotte Hospital, the helicopters you heard were on the way. And so we're coordinating very well to get these officers to safety, which we were able to do.
Sure.
To get to the hospital. It's important to know that the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department was already on board, and they were blocking exits for an ambulance that could get up the interstate and to CMC Maine. And so we were able to take McCall into custody without any further incident, and he was rendered medical aid and taken to the Charlotte Hospital, where he stayed for 2 months trying to recover from the wounds that he sustained from our gunfire.
What role does the fire department play in all that?
They actually can render first responder aid, but
Sure.
This particular night, they responded and set up the landing zone for the medevac helicopters to take our officers out. We have predetermined landing zones, and they are the communications and sort of the light to shine on those landing zones for that helicopter to come in safe and get out safely.
Okay, so at that point, the suspect is in custody, and he's on his way to the hospital, as of course all the officers who've been injured are. So I know when I first heard about that, it was in the early morning hours, about 5 o'clock in the morning. Got the text that this had taken place, and that officers were at the hospital being treated. So it was. You know, people wonder, what does the prosecutor's role in all this? Of course, my first concern was for the well-being of the officers who were injured. You know, 4 officers shot at this point. Sergeant Clinton, Sergeant Randy Clinton, the first officer, shot at the first location, and then the 3 that you just mentioned. So I went to the hospital that morning. I was right there early that morning, going around trying to find out how everybody was doing. So in addition to that, I met with Chief Mark Keel from the State Law Enforcement Division. Because an incident like this involves officers from your department, you can't be the one that investigates where you're also the victim. So An independent agency, the State Law Enforcement Division out of Columbia, dispatched a tremendous number of officers to come down and help at the scene and assist and take over the investigation into the shooting.
What is your role at that point?
Well, I went and met with Chief Keel. I was actually at the scene after I left the hospital, met with him there, I walked around. There's no way you can substitute for actually seeing where something took place with your own eyes and getting the lay of the land. So I was out there a few hours after the incident took place, walking around and getting an understanding of what took place as best they could tell us, along with my deputy solicitor, Willie Thompson. And you know, basically what I do at that point is try to help give legal advice on any search issues, if there are questions about what they should do or what type of evidence they should be looking for. They can help. I can help with that. Also, when it comes to the evidence that's already been collected, we know what we need for court. That we start thinking about building our case from the very beginning. How is this going to be presented in court? How are we going to make our case to a jury if necessary? What do we need to know? So we give advice on forensic testing, for example. We can suggest that, you know, these weapons need to be collected and tested to find out which shell casings came from which guns and that sort of thing.
So at this point, the suspect is now a defendant, and
yes.
He's sort of now kind of transitioned into your.
Yeah. This wasn't really a whodunit, you know, from the beginning, because obviously he was under the porch and he was shot up as well, and the gun's there with him. So this wasn't really a question of trying to figure out who was responsible for this. But he was in custody, and because he was injured, he was taken to North Carolina, which created another problem for us in terms of getting him back here, because it's not just a question of loading him into an ambulance and bringing him back down. We have to go through a process called extradition. So we obtained governor's warrants, obtained warrants for his arrest in South Carolina, listed him as a fugitive from justice from the state of South Carolina, and then contacted North Carolina and said, we believe this fugitive is in your jurisdiction. And we worked, our governor's office works with their governor's office to get a warrant issued to have him picked up and brought back down to South Carolina. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg District Attorney's Office worked with us very well in making sure that that went smoothly, and he waived extradition actually, and we were able to bring him back down to South Carolina so that we could actually formally serve the murder warrant for Detective Mike Doty's murder, as well as the attempted murder charges on the other 3 officers. And
so that'll lead us into our next segment after the break. Is
yeah, we can talk a little bit about. That's right. We can talk a little bit about what took place after we come back from this break. Please join us. We're back, and thank you very much for joining us. And we are in the process, myself and Sheriff Tolson, of describing some of the circumstances that took place surrounding the investigation of Christian McCall and the shooting death of Detective Mike Doty, and the shooting of 3 other officers back in January of this year. And when we left off, we were explaining how we had to extradite Mr. McCall back down from North Carolina because he'd been taken there for treatment. And so we were able to get him back in, and once he came down here, he was served with the murder warrants and the attempted murder warrants.
And let me ask, at this point, Kevin, who are you representing? Are you representing McCall's wife? Are you representing the sheriff's office? Are you who do you represent?
Well, as the solicitor, that's a good question. Thank you. As the solicitor, I am the representative of the people. I don't really have a client in the traditional sense that a lawyer does. You go hire a lawyer and he represents you, and he's going to look out for your interests. My interests are seeing to it that justice is done, whatever form that takes. Sometimes we get cases in where we look at the evidence and it's insufficient to prosecute, and our job at that point as a minister of justice is to dismiss a bad case. But when the case is good, the evidence is solid and conclusive, we move forward with prosecuting. So I don't really have a client per se, not the sheriff's office, not Mrs. McCall, the victim in the domestic, nor the officers
representing society
who were shot.
And law and order.
I'm just trying to make sure that the right thing is done in each and every case.
So this is an extremely complex, large scale case.
Yes.
And ended up being disposed of in about 4 months. Talk
Yes.
a little bit about what
Well-
went on in those 4 months.
Well, essentially, after the defendant was charged, a bond was denied because of the serious nature of these charges. Bond was denied, and he was held in detention until the case was resolved. And at that point, my job is, I've got a lot of different things I'm doing, a lot of pots that I've got to stir and keep, moving things forward. Of course, one of the most important things that we do is making sure that the victims in this case, the officers that were shot, and of course the family of Detective Doty, that we meet with them and we kind of give them an understanding of where the case is at, where the investigation is at, what the evidence is, so that they can kind of know where we're at. And I do that throughout the process. It may just be a phone call from time to time if it's a small issue, or if it's something that's going to require extensive discussion, we can bring them into the office and sit down and have a face-to-face. But
This case is a little bit unique. I'm sorry, this case is a little bit unique in that you also have Christian McCall's wife, who's also a victim.
That's right. And so we had to talk to her as well. And of course, she's a victim in the domestic violence, but it's also her husband who's been charged. So that was a little bit tricky. But we were able to keep everybody posted more or less on how things were going throughout this. And when we meet with victims, we don't just talk to them about where the case is at and investigation-wise. In a case like this, it's important that they understand sort of what the options are going forward, what's going to happen in this case, or what could happen. Given that this was a case involving the murder of a police officer who was performing in the course of his duties, it was certainly eligible for the death penalty, and that was discussed with the family extensively. I've been a prosecutor for well over 25 years, and I have prosecuted many capital cases. I've sent folks to death row, so I know what is involved with that. And of course, it's a long process. People I sent to death row in the early and mid-90s are still in jail waiting.
And ultimately, that's your decision, but
It is.
you
But
take into account.
I have to take into account what the victims want to do. That's right. I want to know, because they're the ones that are living it, and they're the ones that are going to have to live with these decisions. So I take very seriously what they say.
Both you and I were working when the last police officer was murdered in the line of duty in 1992, Brent McCants, and of course his killer is still sitting on death row.
Yeah.
Some 26 years later.
92 is when Brent was killed, and he was sent to death row in September of 95, and he sits there still. So Mr. McCall was 47 years old. So, the probability of the calendar getting to him before the state of South Carolina could was pretty high, and I told the family that, and they couldn't have been more gracious and decent, good people to deal with. Mike's family was just wonderful, as were the other 3 officers that were shot that day. Just good people to talk to, reasonable folks. So we had good conversations, and I think the consensus among them was, that the death penalty was an option. If he wanted to pursue a trial and wanted to go forward, well, I made it clear I think that's the way we need to go. But if he was willing to accept responsibility quickly.
Mm-hmm. And the eventual outcome was a guilty plea.
That's right. That's exactly right. So if we could get to that point, that was kind of the understanding I got from them, is if we could get to that point quickly and get this behind them so they could begin sort of trying to move on, then that was preferential. But before we get to the plea, we've got a number of other things that we have to do, which, of course, the investigation is ongoing. He's in the hospital in Charlotte for a number of months, so we've got a bunch of different things going on. And we got all the file in, reviewed the evidence, and negotiated with the defense attorneys, and ultimately were able to accomplish that.
Really unique that was done in 4 months. I don't know that that's done anywhere else that I'm aware of.
It was good for the family to get that behind them. I think it helps them a lot.
Absolutely.
Well, we have a lot of other things we can talk about in the future episodes, in addition to other crimes that have taken place here. We can talk about all the different features and facets and different parts of our offices going forward. I'm excited about that. I want to take a quick minute and thank some folks. Of course, this show is brought to you courtesy of the Carpel Foundation, which funds the show, CN2, and the great people at York Tech who are helping us create the show here in their studio at York Tech. Wonderful facility over here. And of course,
I always take the opportunity when I can to thank the public for the tremendous amount of support that they have given the Sheriff's Office and our law enforcement regionally since the 16th. It's truly been overwhelming, and it has certainly helped the office heal.
it's been wonderful. It has. Well, I thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to being with you again in future episodes.